New World Next Week. I'm James Corbett of CorbettReport.com.
And I'm James Evan Pilato of MediaMonarchy.com. We've got crowds on demand and Kerry's Plan B for Syria. But first, Flint residents paid America's highest water rates. We get this via the Detroit Press. Flint residents paid the highest water rates in America, even as their water was tainted with lead, according to a national study released yesterday by the public interest group Food and Water Watch. A survey of the 500 largest water systems in the country conducted last year found that on average, Flint residents paid about $864 a year for water service, nearly double the national average and about 3.5 times as much as Detroiters pay. The figure is based on an annual household consumption of 60,000 gallons. Quote, it far exceeds what the United Nations designates as affordable for water and sewer service, said Mary Grant, one of the study's authors. The United Nations recommends that water and sewage service shouldn't exceed 3% of a household income. In Flint, it exceeded 7%. A Flint lawyer who sued to reduce the rates say they are high in part because city officials and state-appointed emergency managers have tapped water and sewer money for other needs. They've been using that money improperly for years to fund the general operations of the city, said Valdemar L. Washington, who's been battling the rate increases in court since 2012. So this battle has been going on for many, many years, even though we just found out about the poison very recently. The city's sewer fund had a balance of $36 million in 2006, but was running a $23 million deficit by 2012. Hey, guess what? The city didn't respond to requests for comment on the lawsuit claims. Now, James, we've not really covered this story, but we have been covering water wars for many, many years. Your thoughts on the Detroit-Flint crisis?
Well, let's just add a little bit of context to this. Don't forget that last month we had this headline: leaked emails, government officials mocked Flint residents who complained about water. So not only were they knowingly giving them, fudging the lead levels in the tests that they were doing, they were then mocking the actual residents of Flint for the fact that they were poisoning them. Wonderful stuff. Beautiful stuff. So let's just put on our imaginary thinking cap. Let's imagine there's a company, Cadbury or whatever, that is secretly, either purposefully or just by accident, are poisoning people through their candy bars or whatever. I mean, more so than usual. There's actual, some toxic poisonous substance going in there. And then it gets discovered, and then these emails, internal corporate emails, come out showing that they were mocking the people who were eating this toxic nonsense. What do you think would happen to that company? What do you think people would do in response to that? Would they continue to buy those candy bars? I'm thinking they wouldn't. I'm thinking that company would suffer the economic consequences and go bankrupt and face a bajillion lawsuits, which would, completely dissolve anything that they had left of any holdings that they had. So what happens when a city government is the one that's poisoning their citizens and feeding them garbage and mocking them behind their back? Absolutely none. A few people, of course, are going to, have their heads on the chopping block, and they're going to get fired. But the city government isn't going to go under. People can't get up and take their patronage elsewhere. They're helpless in all of this because what are you going to do? Government has a monopoly, and they have to have a monopoly over services like these because, well, if the government angels aren't watching over these things, who's gonna be in charge of it? So, if this isn't a case for anarchism, I don't know what is.
James, you reminded me, talking there, actually, a story that broke today that I mentioned on my morning show this morning is Johnson & Johnson just got hit with a $70 million verdict for knowingly lying to people about their shower-to-shower and baby powder stuff, talcum powder-based, causes cancer. They were actually charged and found guilty of conspiracy.
And for anyone who continues to buy their crap at this point, it's up on them. That's your problem if you continue to support companies that do crap like that.
Mm-hmm. So, James, we've got the PDF link so people, at least here in the States, can see how their own city stacks up. It's the state of public water in the United States. On MediaMonarchy.com, I've got 7 years worth of stories about pharmaceuticals in the water, weed killer in the water, radioactive water, and I'll include that link to just the archives on MediaMonarchy.com. And I've worked with some of the people from Food and Water Watch right here in Portland, where we successfully kept fluoride out of the water a couple of years ago, but not so much Nestle out of the everywhere else. Our second story this week on New World Next Week, we go abroad, where John Kerry says, hey, if the ceasefire fails, partition of Syria is plan B. And this comes via an article by Jason Ditz on antiwar.com. Speaking of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that is, yesterday, February 23rd, as I come to you, Secretary of State John Kerry suggested the latest push for a ceasefire in Syria could amount to the last chance for one, and suggested that the U.S. would see a partition of the country as Plan B. Kerry didn't offer any details on how this would work, of course, but that fact that the U.S. is mentioning partition at all is a huge step, as the U.S. has fiercely resisted similar considerations in neighboring Iraq, which itself is facing a near-identical war with many of the same players. Kerry said if the ceasefire didn't go into place, it would soon be too late to allow Syria to remain whole, too big to fail, I don't know, and that the partition of the country could form an eventual solution to the civil war, which has raged for the past 5 years. Though a de facto partition has existed in Syria for months now, with fighting along the margins, it's unfathomable but that the international community could recognize it as a de jure, or lawful, rather, separation, so long as ISIS controls around half of the country and Al-Qaeda's Nusra Front has its own contiguous statelet in the north. Though partition is meant to suggest a split on government/rebel lines, the reality is the rebels don't hold enough territory to be a country, and the partition would amount to a recognition of the ISIS caliphate as a state of its own. James, we've been going over the situation in Syria from time to time for quite some time here on New World Next Week, but it constantly seems to sort of spiral out of control and the stories sort of change. So can you explain it to me like I'm a regular old American, because I am, what's happening right now in Syria?
Well, let me read this interesting op-ed that was just a piece of this op-ed that was published last week. It says, the dissolution of Syria and Iraq later on into ethnically or religiously unique areas, such as in Lebanon, is Israel's primary target on the Eastern Front in the long run, while the dissolution of the military power of those states serves as the primary short-term target. Syria will fall apart, in accordance with its ethnic and religious structure, into several states, such as in present-day Lebanon, so that there will be a Shiite Alawi state along its coast, a Sunni state in the Aleppo area, another Sunni state in Damascus hostile to its northern neighbor, and the Druzes who will set up a state, maybe even in our Golan, and certainly in the Hauran in northern Jordan. This state of affairs will be the guarantee for peace and security in the area in the long run, and that aim is already within our reach today. Oh wait, sorry, that wasn't published last week. That wasn't an op-ed. That was published in 1982. It's called the Oded Yunon Plan, or also known as the Zionist Plan for the Middle East. Look it up, guys. This has been on the drawing board for decades. This is admitted Israel foreign policy strategy to break up Syria, to break up Iraq. Iraq, mission accomplished. They're already divided basically into three different states, and Syria's well on its way to being divided right now, and now they're coming out and saying, Plan B is to break up the country. Who would have thought it, except people who actually read these foreign policy documents decades ago? So, mission accomplished. Everything's going A-OK and according to plan to the Zionists and to the United States, and to, of course, the benefit of the Saudis and Qataris and all of those people who are also going to be benefiting from the breakup of Syria, except for, the millions of people in Syria. I mean, they're screwed. But other than that, I mean, everything's going according to plan.
This is essentially John Kerry's lot, isn't it? I think we've talked about this from time to time. Throughout his career, he's brought in at the appropriate times to sort of broker a common sense solution to whether it's killing people in Vietnam or banks in BCCI and Iran-Contra, or seemingly coming in to sort of help Obama's second term. And like, oh man, we're really falling apart. Let's get John the Fixer Kerry in here. So he's just, working overtime, flying all over the place. Hey, guess what else Kerry's been up to? Meeting with Hollywood execs to pitch ISIS propaganda ideas. That's right, from the CIA cutout creators of Zero Dark 30, coming soon to a theater near you. And that story I covered last Friday on, again, I keep mentioning the morning show, James, because I find in a lot of ways I haven't been doing a regular show. So now sort of being back and doing a regular show, again, it's like, hey, I covered that. Hey, we've talked about this. Hey, we've gone through a lot of these stories, and we've able to sort of lay out, I think, hopefully what's coming. And again, we're not fortune tellers or seeing the future or anything. We've just kind of been paying attention. So our third and final story this week, James, is about a really real and confirmed hoaxing going on. It's Truman Show USA, as concerned citizens at town hall meetings exposed as paid actors. This was submitted to us on Twitter at MumNRZ, and it comes from a post written back in the summer of 2013 originally on Liberty Blitzkrieg. They had an article called Protesters for Hire. For a few $1,000s, we'll buy you a small entourage, where they wrote then, here's a bothersome trend that seems quite fitting for the smoke and mirrors-driven, celebrity-obsessed hologram society that America has become. A company known as Crowds on Demand is actually in the business of providing fake protesters for causes, fake entourages for wannabe celebrities, and seemingly fake supporters for unpopular corporate activities. Southern California's KNBC TV has a full video on a news story that kind of exposed this whole thing, as one paid actor kind of came back to the stage, if you will, to basically say, I was paid $100 to say that stuff. So we'll include links to that, James, just like everything else we kind of say and play on these shows. It'll be included in the show notes. And it kind of feels like Groundhog's Day, that we've talked about a lot of this before, and whether it's, yes, Donald Trump had fake supporters at an event, or Comcast will hire homeless people to fill up seats so that you can't go to a public hearing and speak your mind. We've been seeing this a lot, but as the presidential selection emotional con game starts to ratchet up into higher and higher gear, we're going to see this sort of fakery a lot more, aren't we?
We certainly are, and I'm glad you brought that up, because actually I was just listening to Morning Monarchy here on my Fondle Slab, just so it's there on the record. I was listening to that, and you were making the point that there are every few weeks there's these stories that come up that were actually from 3 or 4 years ago, and you didn't. It's just being propagated as if it's a new story, and everyone's picking it up. And I swear when I saw this, I thought, haven't we covered this on New World Next Week? But I think you're right. I think it was probably the Comcast homeless story or some version like that we've covered in the past, where, yeah, people hire homeless people, actors, whatever, just to fill seats in various places to make it look like there's a movement. And yeah, of course, I mean, politics is all about perception. It's all about the puppets on the stage and people mindlessly cheering. Of course, you can just pay people to mindlessly cheer and make it look like someone's more popular than they are. And it's all about the perception, because as we know, the votes are really decided by the voting machines at this point, and the voting machines are controlled by, Diebold or various companies like that. And so all they need to do is to make you think that this candidate is genuinely popular, so that when the voting machines take the election for them, you go, oh, okay, well, seems about right. So, I mean, we are in total fantasy land when it comes to the charade of politics. But as you said in Morning Monarchy on the Cyberspace War, you were talking about how it's the emotional con game. And that's exactly what it is. It's an emotional con game. Do not invest yourself in it.
Well, and I remember, I don't know that I've explained that here. I got that phrase many, many years ago. There was a guy who used to do work with Webster Tarpley. His name was Daniel Abramson, and he had a news site and a regular podcast called False Flag News. We're going back into alt media history here. And by that point, people like him and other activists like Greg Nixon all pretty much quit and were like, 9/11 truth is dead. I think the people who pulled it off have gotten away with it, and they've moved on to their next scheme, and I think it's probably going to be financial. Lo and behold, they were right. And I, at the time, I think got, perturbed by calling the elections an emotional con game, because I was feeling the Ron Paul burn at the time. But now, 8 years later, and again, watching 8 years of Obama and 8 years of Bush should kind of let you know that it doesn't really matter what phony they put in there, James. And I'll have one last note about that as we wrap up some of our other headlines. And I appreciate you checking out the Morning Monarchy. So speaking of a Brave New World, James, I got a couple of other deprogramming notes from the Media Monarchy Kingdom, if you'll be so kind. I've got a new episode of Navigating Netflix where we talk about the Hunger Games series with Eric Mueller, who's just one of the members of the Tragedy and Hope community. And the latest episode of Good News Next Week, When Bread Makes Beer, Food Waste is toast, and we talk about some of the other ways that we are winning, and that may be, James, why we've been lacking some good news here on New World Next Week. I've been taking it all for good news next week because there's not a whole hell of a lot of it to spread around, actually. Any good news you know of?
If I do, I'll tweet it out. But I hope other people will too. Yeah, please keep the suggestions coming in for good news stories.
Absolutely. So we'll wrap up New World Next Week, episode 259, with a couple of the other New World Next Week headlines we are watching. The Netherlands may hold a referendum on whether or not to quit the EU. The science used to regulate Monsanto's Roundup is outdated, says one study. Meanwhile, a different study notes again that your cell phone is blowing up your sperm count. And finally, James, a psychologist argues our new tech overlords like Facebook and Google are capable of, quote, undetectable and untraceable manipulations of entire populations, end quote, in his new long-read article, The New Mind Control, How the Internet Flips Elections and Alters Our Thoughts. And he sources back to a recent Wired article about how Google will throw the election. And so if the machines don't get it one way, they've already kind of foisted you into one direction in another way, James.
One Direction. What a not
Well, you know, the Brit Awards are probably trending right now. So
there you